Wonderful. Okay, so we usually begin our meetings by praying the Lord's Prayer together, and then we'll start the festivities. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have a special treat today. It's not often that one gets to listen to and talk to someone who is genuinely a world leader in their field. And that's exactly what we're going to get to do today. Professor Sebastian Brock has been researching and writing in Syriac Studies and Aramaic Studies for, correct me if I'm wrong, please, the last 61 years. So he began his career before I was born, and that's saying something. He is therefore a very experienced scholar, I believe fluent in Syriac and possibly some other
fluent.
But certainly quite capable. He's worked with so many texts from that tradition, has brought his critical skills to that work in a way that has been taken up and used by so many other scholars around the world. And I believe a year or two ago, he also became an Oriental Orthodox Christian. So a member of a sister Orthodox church. Today, he will be telling us about the Church of the East, a community that has been around for a very long time, but similar to the Coptic experience in some ways, has also suffered quite a lot of different kinds of misunderstanding and persecution. So today, it's in the title. Our group is called Aletheia. We search for the truth. And today we hope that we will be able, through the wisdom and knowledge that Sebastian brings, we'll be able to come to a more realistic understanding of this fascinating church. And without further ado, over to you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Father Antonius. Very kind of you. I shall really be talking about preliminaries and how to approach this problem of conflicting or apparently conflicting Christologies. So I'm not going to plunge into the actual details of it, which are extremely complex and would not be suitable for this occasion. But let me start by saying that studying Syriac gives one a great advantage, which no other language has, because in Syriac literature, we have preserved texts from all three traditions, Oriental Orthodox, Church of the East, and Chalcedonian. And a lot of those texts are polemic. So one tries to get behind the polemic and discover what the problems really are and why those problems arose. And one can shed a certain amount of light on what's gone wrong and why it's gone wrong. But it's important to make a start with a number of preliminary sort of thoughts, really. And the first and most important thing is to remember that the question of the incarnation and how to describe it, the descent of the divine into the human sphere, it's a mystery. It's an ineffable mystery that can never be properly described. People, of course, have tried to describe it, and they've come up with some quite decent conclusions. But it's never going to be the case of one single formula, as it were, that is going to describe it correctly and everything else is wrong. what is in fact going to be the case, as one soon finds out, that there are many different ways of describing what that mysterious event was. And most of these ways are perfectly acceptable. There are a few ways of describing it which are not acceptable, and those are the ones that are traditionally known as heretical. And we all know exactly what those were. So that's the first thing. Remember that we're talking about a mystery which one cannot satisfactorily describe. One can make various efforts, but nothing is going to be, as it were, exclusive of other possible explanations. And the second preliminary observation that one needs to keep in mind, at the Church of the East is not just an abstract in the air, but it's a body of fellow Christians. And so we need to treat them with respect. And that means trying to understand what their position on Christology really is. And in the process of understanding that, it means avoiding all the misunderstandings and misrepresentations of the past. And one of the things one notices if one studies the polemical literature of the 5th and 6th century, which was the height of the controversy, is that each side didn't have the, or with very few exceptions, didn't have the imagination, shall we say, to put themselves in the shoes of their opponent, their theological opponent. And so they saw their theological opponent as they understood the opponent's situation and not as the opponent's situation actually was. In the 20th century, when the ecumenical movement started up, in the second half of the 20th century, when the Oriental Orthodox churches got involved with the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Church from the 1960s onward, the polemical atmosphere was not present. And that meant that people could understand the other party's position much better, much more empathetic. Needn't necessarily be sympathetic, because you don't have to accept their position. And that's very important to remember, but to understand that position. So we in the modern world have this advantage that we're not in the middle of the theological controversy, which had all sorts of side aspects, political, two empires, the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, all sorts of things which sort of muddied the waters. But also in the heat of controversy, things go wrong. So that's a very important thing. Try to understand what our fellow Christians in the Church of the East actually think. What is the position of their church? So trying to understand the Christology of the Church of the East, this means what one hopes will be the result, and what seems to me to be the result, is that properly understood, one can see it as an objectively acceptable position on Christology. It's not one's own, but it's not a wrong one. And this has been the thing that's bedeviled controversy. It's been an either-or situation. Either you accept one formula or you reject it. But it's much more complicated than that. And there are many ways of expressing an acceptable Christology. The Church of the East has chosen one. It's actually very close to that of the Roman Catholic position, and especially close in the 5th and 6th century. when, of course, one must remember that the Church of the East was largely outside the Roman Empire, in the Persian Empire, and that had an important consequence, which people often forget. We speak of the ecumenical councils, so those accepted by the Oriental Orthodox, Nicaea, Constantinople, and Ephesus. The ecumenical councils were convoked by the Roman emperor. That means that only bishops from within the Roman Empire actually were there. So the Church of the East, outside the Roman Empire, had nothing to do with the actual goings on of these councils. And that's very important to remember. In the case of Nicaea, whose 14th century we are celebrating at the moment, the Council of Nicaea was officially received by the Church of the East nearly a century later. It was in 410. The Council was in 325, so very long time afterwards. So in that case, the council was received, and it's, of course, the most important of all the councils. But the other councils, the Church of the East was not involved in. So that's a very important point to remember. And this fact that they were growing up, developing their own Christology and understanding of the mystery of the incarnation, this was taking place in a different part of the ancient world. So in the Persian Empire, Sasanian Empire, as opposed to the Roman Empire. It was also in a different language, but Syriac, in fact, covered both, both empires. And people exaggerate, I think, the difference between Greek and Syriac. Syriac is perfectly capable, if it wants, to express very complicated ideas. But the problem lies in how things are translated. But that's the point I may come back to later. So what one needs to do in approaching this question of Christology of the Church of the East is trying to understand what their tradition is actually saying, as opposed to what historically it's been thought by outsiders to have believed, which turns out to be different. And the other thing is, if one's able to see that objectively its position is an acceptable position, not a heretical one, then it's not a question of having to take over their position oneself. So there's no danger of a threat to one's own position. It's simply an expansion of one's vision, as it were. So it's incorporating a true vision of, true conception of a different church's approach. So those are very important starting points. And if one doesn't take them into mind, one's going to get into difficulties and all sorts of misunderstandings. Now, a very important thing to remember is that if you're dealing with Christology, it matters very much where you're starting from. And in the case of the Church of the East, one thing that was absolutely basic to their tradition was the utter transcendence of God. Of course, that's common to all the traditions, but it was the actual starting point and explains all sorts of things in the way that the Christology has developed in the Church of the East. So if you have this starting point of the great difference between the divine world and the human world, the utter transcendence of the divine, then the problem of the incarnation becomes even greater. How do you explain the relationship between the divine in the incarnate Christ and the human? And this feeling of the transcendence of the divine is one of the reasons why in the tradition of the Church of the East, great emphasis is laid on the humanity of Christ. And it's not so much a dividing between the divinity and humanity, but the distinction of the two. So that's a very important thing to remember. And here there's a linguistic point which is worth remembering. In both Greek and Syriac, the words sometimes used for divide and for distinguish are the same. So if someone's writing using one of these words meaning distinguish, their opponents are likely to say, oh, you mean divide, don't you? And that, of course, is not the case, but it means that according to the opponents, the position is going to be heretical. So this is part of the trouble, that a single term can have rather different, very different senses. So one needs to keep this sort of thing in mind. The linguistic problems involved both in Greek and in Syriac. So the transcendence of God is so important in the point of view, from point of view of the Church These. So you have this distinction between divine and human in the incarnate Christ. Now, the other thing that is very important, another starting point really, is people's conceptual models. Put it that way. How do you understand that salvation was achieved? And in antiquity, people came up with all sorts of different reasons, but one can say that there are basically two different approaches, which on the surface seem to be conflicting, but in fact should be taken together, and they're both true. And they're both true because of the way that sacred time works. Sacred time is concerned with the content of what happens and not with the temporality of where in the history of progress of time it happens. And that's very important to remember. And that is an essential point to remember in any Eucharistic celebration of liturgy. Sacred time behaves in a different way, needs to be understood in a different way from the way historical, ordinary time functions. So we've got two main conceptual models of how humanity is saved by the incarnation. The first one is the one that is most prominent in the Oriental Orthodox tradition. You'll find it stressed everywhere in the liturgical text, but not exclusively, and this is important to remember. And this is that the divinity underpins humanity at the moment of conception. So that means that you must emphasize the oneness in Christ, whereas as we saw with the transcendence as the starting point, you need to keep the distinction, the duality, and we'll see why in a minute. So from the Oriental point of view, you've got to stress the oneness because salvation is, as it were, achieved primarily at the moment of conception. So humanity is underpinned. So put it in the traditional language as one nature out of two, one composite nature. So the oneness is always the predominant element. So that's the Oriental Orthodox emphasis. It's not the only position. The emphasis of the Church of the East is different. And this is partly dependent, well, largely dependent, I suppose, logically, on the emphasis on the transcendence of God, so the need to keep distinguished the divinity and the humanity in the incarnate Christ. So this second conceptual model sees humanity being raised up at the resurrection and ascended with the body of Christ at the ascension. So during the incarnate life of Christ, it's very important to make this distinction between the divinity and the humanity. Otherwise, it's all going wrong and humanity won't be saved. You'll get a sort of mixture of humanity and divinity, which is raised up to heaven. Whereas what you want is just humanity raised up. So there's two different emphases, one focusing on the conception, moment of conception, the other focusing on the ascension, final moment of Christ's incarnate life. Now, as I say, both of these are true, and in historical time, they are separate, but in sacred time, they come together, they run together. It's rather like the case in the Eucharist of the words of institution and the epiclesis. Historically, in historical time, they're separated by a few minutes. In sacred time, they run together. So it's the same thing, but in this time, the sacred time runs together over 30 years. So this is very important to remember. We've got these two conceptual models, which on the surface seem to conflict. There's one's emphasizing conception as the moment, the other's emphasizing the ascension as the moment when humanity is saved. But as I said, both are valid, and both are to be found in the liturgical texts of both traditions. So that is very important to remember. And one often forgets that it's not the formulae of the councils that the church is, and they're very important, of course, that the church is actually sort of living. They're living the liturgical texts. And so one can, if one studies the liturgical text carefully, one can isolate different emphases. And that's what, in fact, I tried to do. And in the Oriental Orthodox tradition, I once made the experiment of collecting texts which emphasized the ascension, as in the Church of the East sort of primary emphasis. And there are a lot of them. So it's not a question of either or, it's both and. And that's so often the case in the questions that one's dealing with. So both these are valid approaches, they're both true, and it's just that the two sides, as it were, two different ecclesial traditions have different emphases in their liturgical texts, but they're not exclusive, they're inclusive in both. So, so much depends on where you start from, what conceptual models you have, and that's going to explain a lot of the sort of developments that take place in the course of time. Now, I'd like to turn to just two of the, maybe if there's time, I may include one more, two of the traditional stumbling blocks. that sort of are standing in the way of any sort of rapprochement between the Oriental churches and the Assyrian Church of the East. First, of course, is the name of Nestorius. Now, when one says the Church of the East is Nestorian, well, that's what their enemies have always called them. In the Middle Ages, it's true that in very common discourse, they were referred to as Nestorian, and in modern discourse, some people want to keep the name, other people don't, within that tradition. And scholars likewise. I'm all for dropping the name Nestorian because it's so confusing, but a dear Russian colleague of mine, who's now dead, was very keen that it should be kept, and he was a great fan of the Church of the East. So that's modern scholarship divided. That's not important. Well, when one's talking about the term Nestorian, one's thinking, of course, Nestorius. Now, Nestorius was indeed a historical person. He was Patriarch of Constantinople. And I remember I was at the consecration of the previous Mardencha, previous Catholicos of the Church of the East. It took place in London because that was the only place all the bishops could get visas for. So I was there in London, and I remember Mardencha said, Nestorius of the Greek, he's not one of us. So he was keen to dissociate himself from the name. Well, Nestorius, as a historical figure who was condemned, his position was condemned on various occasions and by various councils. In modern scholarship, no one really knows what he really thought. Most of his writings from the polemical period have been lost. The one long writing, which survives in Syriac, is written when he was in exile in Egypt many years later, around about 450. So more or less the time of Chalcedon. And that is not a good guide to what his position in the controversy of the 430s. And also, it's not an influential text in the Church of the East at all. It wasn't translated until the middle of the 6th century, so a long time after, and it's never had any great influence. So Nestorius's theology, whatever one thinks of it, is not an important factor in the development of the Christology of the Church of the East. Nestorius for the Church of the East is, one could say, a martyr figure who was unjustly treated both by the state authorities and by Cyril of Alexandria. So that's their position. Here's a name, and there is an anaphora under his name, which is certainly not by him, but it's an old anaphora, and there's nothing, as it were, Nestorian in it. So one needs to remember that is the case of how the Church of the East regard Nestorius. He's one of the three great names, Diodor, Theodore, and Nestorius, of the exegetical tradition of the Church of the East, and to a certain extent of the Christological tradition. Theodore is actually much the most influential of all those. Nestorius very much on the side. So that's how Nestorius is regarded by the Church of the East. Now, by the Oriental Orthodox, of course, is regarded as the worst of heretics because he divides Christ, sort of split personality, as it were, giving Christ a split personality by, according to traditional polemic, claiming that there are two sons, the Son of God and the Son of Mary, that they're different. That is, in fact, a misrepresentation of their position, as so often in these polemical texts. It's rather like in the modern situation, anyone who is a socialist gets called by their enemies a communist. And so one has to, as it were, adjust the polemical language to what is in fact the true case, that socialists are true socialists and not communists, and they are not as seen by their opposite side. So that's very important to remember in the case of the term Nestorian and the person of Nestorius. There are three different Nestoriuses, one could say. The historical one, about whom one really doesn't know quite what he thought. Then the Nestorius of the Church of the East, who is a martyr figure, who's respected, and that's just about all. And then there's the Oriental Orthodox, and to some extent, yes, to the Chalcedonian too, Nestorius, a heretic, who divided Christ in a totally unacceptable way. And if they really thought that, it would be a heretical position. There's no doubt about that. But they didn't think like that. So their position needs looking at again. So that's the first stumbling block. And it's very important to keep that in mind, that there's three different Nestoriuses. And you need to say who you're talking about when discussing this matter. The second one is another one that comes up, it seems, all the time, and that is the refusal of the title Theotokos, Yoldatologo in Syriac, bearer of God, for Mary, and instead using Christotokos, the bearer of Christ. And this is quite a complicated question. In their main theologian, Babai the Great, who lived, he died in 628, he has a long and interesting discussion of this. He says that Theotokos, bearer of God, is not wrong, but it's, from his point of view, is misleading. And indeed, from the Christology of the Church of the East, where you need to distinguish between divinity and humanity in Christ, it's actually important to use the term Christotokos, so the incarnate Christ. So Mary gives birth to the incarnate Christ, who is both divine and human, the two natures being distinguished in the Church of the East tradition. Because if you say that she is Theotokos, then you are, as it were, undermining the effect of the incarnation as bringing about salvation, because you're, as it were, you're confusing divine, or mixing, bringing them together, divine and human, as it were, too early before the ascension, when Christ's humanity is raised up with our humanity at the ascension. So during the incarnate life of Christ, for the Church of the East, it's very important to keep this distinction, and logically to keep the distinction of Christotokos when you're speaking of Mary. And she's he sees that there are possible contexts where you can call it, and indeed he sees that from certain Christological traditions, it's actually the norm to call her Theotokos, bearer of God. But from his own tradition, the Church of the East, it's misleading, and so that's why you won't find Theotokos in the liturgical texts. It will be a mother of Christ. It has nothing to do with the idea of two sons, the Son of Mary and the Son of God, as being separate identities. There's, if you read the text of the Church of the East, the Son of God and the Son of Mary are identical, as in all the other traditions. So those are the two main stumbling blocks which need to be explained in order to get a proper understanding of what's going on. I will just mention one further stumbling block, and then I will stop, and we can have some questions if you have some. And this is the question of terminology. As I mentioned before, one of the problems is both the Greek and the Syriac verb, which can in certain circumstances mean both divide and both divide and distinguish. And you have to know which is the case in specific contexts. And so that's an easy way of misunderstanding, and sometimes deliberately misunderstanding, which is bad. The other problematic word in the Christological vocabulary, which of course is based on Chalcedon, so a council that they think is equally illogical in its doctrinal formula, just as the Oriental Orthodox say it's illogical. But it's illogical from a different point of view, from the Church of the East's point of view. So all these terms, nature, hypostasis, and person, they are sort of fossilized by the Chalcedonian definition. And of course, it's very important to go beyond those other ways of formulating. There are many other ways one can speak about these mysteries. But since the Chalcedonian terminology has sort of dominated all the polemics on all sides, one has to take it into account and try and explain, what do people mean by nature? What do they mean by hypostasis? And if you look at this historically, you find that these terms actually have different meanings at different periods, and sometimes at the same period, different meanings for different people. So it's all quite complicated, and you need to realize what's going on. So the term which I'd like to draw attention to here is hypostasis. This is regularly translated into Syriac as pneuma, pneumo. And the term really, it's not a new term. It wasn't invented to translate hypostasis. It's been around for a long time. In earlier Syriac, it is oneself. It's not very common, but you can use pneumo if you're talking about yourself. And in some ways, it's sort of the identity, your identity. Now, in the Church of the East, by the time of Babai the Great, that's the early 7th century, and the great authoritative theologian of the Church of the East still today, he wrote very extensively on Christology, very important works, very, very well thought out. By the time of Babai, the Church of the East formulation, when they're talking of using the Chalcedonian terms, they say two natures and their gnome. Now, what gnome does not mean in that context is hypostases, and two hypostases, which would be a split personality from the Greek understanding of what hypostasis. What to me is apparent that they mean is that the two knomi of the two natures and their knomi. So the two natures and their identifying characteristics. So that's very much in the traditional sense of konoma in the Syriac tradition. Now, if you understand that to be the case, which personally I think to be the case, but not everyone does. In fact, I have a Russian colleague who says I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. I hope I'm not. And that if that is the case, then the Greek equivalent of the their konome would not be hypostasis. And so that, as it were, solves one of the real problems for Chalcedonians who don't like, or for Oriental Orthodox, who don't like the idea of two hypostases. But properly understood, as I see, and I think most people see, the Church of the East is not saying two hypostases when they say their konome, two natures and their konome. They're saying something different. They're the identifying characteristics that make up a nature, as a human nature or a divine nature. So Greek would use different terms. So that's the other really problematic point, the one or two knome. So if one understands these three different stumbling blocks, as I think they should be understood, then you're removing a lot of the bases for considering the position of the Church of the East as heretical. And they are really the fundamental points, which, when they're properly understood, one will see that their language is perfectly acceptable as an alternative way of describing the relationship of the divine to the human in the incarnate Christ. But it's not one that one might not like oneself, and it's not one that definitely not one that one has to accept oneself. But what is important is one must have the broadness of imagination to see that that's another position, not one's own, that is acceptable. So that, I would say, is the basic way of approaching this very complex question. There were rather preliminary points that I made, but if you don't have those starting points, then one's going to run into trouble very quickly. So thank you for listening. I hope I haven't confused you.
Quite the contrary. Thank you very much for bringing a bit of clarity to what's often a complicated area. Now, the way we're going to run tonight is we're going to take questions in the chat. So if you would like to start posting any questions that you'd like to ask in the chat, and then I will read them out for you, Sebastian, and you can address each one as we go along.
I'll try to.
I'm sure you'll do a great job. And while we're just waiting, I can see there are some coming in, but I'm going to get in and put in my question first. So you mentioned, this question about the nature and the gnome and the hypostasis and so on. I get lost in all these terms, to be honest with you. So I'm just going to ask a really sort of basic question. So for the Church of the East, when Christ is hanging on the cross in Golgotha, is there any separation in the human and the divine at that moment? Or is it still the same human and divine unity all the way through the cross and down into Hades and back into the resurrection?
Yes, that's a very important point, and it's a point that's frequently misunderstood. Because of the need to distinguish and not divide or separate the two natures in the incarnate Christ. The Church of the East will say that the divine nature, which is, of course, united with the human nature, the divine nature does not suffer because of the transcendence of the divine, whereas it's the human nature of the incarnate Christ, which is the one person, does suffer. So Christ suffers, but the divinity is beyond suffering. So that's how they would understand it. And this is precisely because of their emphasis on the transcendence of the divinity, and which consequently needs to keep distinguished, not separated, so you're not destroying the oneness of Christ, of the incarnate Christ, but you are distinguishing, as it were, mentally between the two. I think one needs to remember that very often what people are saying in antiquity is that these are mental constructions. So, as we're putting them into flesh and blood, is a different thing. And flesh and blood, of course, will be the humanity. So it's the human divine person who gets crucified. And the great Oriental Orthodox theologian Severus of Antioch at one point says, "En theoria, theoretically, mentally, one can distinguish between the divine and human nature." And this is exactly what the Church of the East are doing when talking about what happens at the crucifixion. So it's a mental process of how to understand something which is, well, beyond human comprehension. But the reason, as I say, is in order to, well, because their great sense of transcendence of the divine. And so from their Christological point of view, they make that distinction, which sounds very bad from the Oriental Orthodox point of view, but their ultimate understanding is that it's Christ, the one person, who suffers. So it's very much the same.
Lovely. Thank
I
you
hope
very
that.
much. Yeah, sorry, keep going.
No, I hope that explains it to some extent, anyhow.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. Thank you very much. So we are getting some good questions here. I'll go first to Father Morosan Maeri. Welcome, Abuna, by the way. So he has another question from the Oriental perspective. Thank you, Sebastian, for such a wonderful presentation. I have a question. When we speak about the Christology of the Church of the East from a Coptic perspective, the issue often seems to become personalized around Cyril of Alexandria. It almost appears that to affirm the position of the Christians of the Church of the East is to imply that Cyril was mistaken. In your view, is this primarily a theological problem, or is it rather a question of the personal authority and legacy of Cyril himself? And how might we move beyond this personalization of ecclesiastical disputes in order to approach the Christological questions more constructively?
Yes, a very good question. I'm not sure how best to answer that. Uh, Usually, I think it's important to get behind questions of individual persons, because in the heat of the polemic, the whole issue gets, as it were, you see it from as it were, personalized perspective, which is wrong. These are issues, theological issues, which are very complicated ones, and it's the issues themselves rather than the individual individuals involved who are important. And this is the case for Nestorius, but it's also the case for Cyril. And Cyril was, well, he was someone who, as well, spoke his views very directly. And of course, he is a great authority in all the Oriental Orthodox traditions, and indeed in the Chalcedonian tradition, though they understand his Christology somewhat differently. And it's much more important, I think, to try and get a sense of what the, as it were, you could call the traditional positions of these churches was. Of course, they're developing still in this period. It's still very much a formative period. So one shouldn't get stuck there. One should try and move on to the stage where these, as well, personal rivalries, which end up in personal polemics, withdraw into the background. And they're certainly there, of course, and influence things, but they shouldn't dominate the discussion. That's how I would answer that.
So if I can just give a sort of a sub question to that question. I've often heard, well, not often, but I have heard people say, well, to accept the Church of the East now would be a betrayal. How can we think that we know better than Saint Cyril? How can we think that today we understand things better than the great pillar of faith?
Well, what Cyril was fighting again was, as it were, Nestorius as understood by the Oriental Orthodox, which indeed is a heretical position. So Cyril is and is defending a position against something that I think the Church of the East would probably find unacceptable themselves, but they wouldn't put it in this way because the name Nestorius, as I pointed out, means totally different things to different people. So it's not betraying Cyril in any sense. It's understanding the true position of what was going on both sides and seeing that position not just from Cyril's position, but also from the standpoint of the Antiochian fathers. He was the Patriarch of Antioch. He was also opposing. So it's much broader than just the question of names. And it's two positions. I think if one sticks to the names, one's going to run into all sorts of trouble. You've got to look beyond them to the actual position, theological, Christological positions. And it's only then that one's going to get some sort of clarity. Otherwise, as I say, one gets stuck in the mud of the polemics of the past, which would be unfortunate.
Yes, and a very sticky puddle of mud it has been, I agree.
Yes.
Mario asks a question. As Oriental Orthodox, we profess a natural and a hypostatic union, one from two. Yet we still believe in a distinction within this nature, and he cites Severus's letters against Julian. If the Church of the East profess a prosopic union instead, and here he cites Metropolitan Bawai Soro, does this not mean that they also create a distinction between a human and divine person or mask within the one Son? This argument is cited by Metropolitan Bishoy's documentary on the Assyrian Church of the East.
Yes, I find all this um, quite problematic to uh, discuss without looking at the text, which we don't have the opportunity to do. I would point simply now to a wonderful passage in Bar Ebroio. He was the equivalent of St. Thomas Aquinas in the Syrian Orthodox tradition, almost exactly contemporary with Thomas Aquinas. And he wrote, besides many other things, he was a real polymath. He wrote on astronomy, he wrote on physics, he wrote on absolutely everything. But he also has a Summa Theologica, uh, same title as Thomas's. And he was someone who really understood the complexities of these issues. Now, in a work which he wrote towards the end of his life called The Book of the Dove, at the end, he says that he realizes, having studied the texts of all the different parties, Chalcedonian, Church of the East, and his own tradition, he realizes that they're all trying to say the same thing, but they make their point of union at different points. So it's either the hypostasis or the nature or the prosopon. But he says what they are all trying to say is exactly the same. And you'll find that, as in Severus in the passage the questioner mentioned, or passages, Barhebraeus also speaks of the, as it were, the duality element in the incarnate Christ. He speaks of the bipinnate, two-winged character of the incarnate Christ. So using a non-technical term, but pointing to the, as it were, the duality. What in Chalcedon would be the two natures, and also Church of these two natures. But so all sides have this logical problem, which is probably insoluble, of how to unite the oneness with this duality of humanity and divinity. So, and they come to different conclusions for different reasons, because they, as I say, they have different starting points. So one's going to find in all the traditions sort of hints at, as it were, the opposite. So Barhebraeus, Severus, the greatest of the proponents of the Oriental Orthodox position, they speak Severus and Theoria. You can speak of, see the two natures distinguished, not separated. And in Barhebraeus's Book of the Dove, he speaks of this bipinnate nature of, or character, bipinnate character of Christ. So the two wings, humanity and the divinity. And if you don't have two wings, you're not going to fly. So that's, I think it's a very nice image. And if there's not one bird, it's not going to fly either. So if each wing is acting separately, it's not going to fly. So I rather like that way of putting it.
Dare I say, a very uplifting image.
Thank you.
So we have a question from Michael, who, by the way, is a great fan of Saint Severus, and he asks,
Good.
"Thank you, Professor Brock. I am interested in your perspective on the state of translations and the theological analyses of the significant theological figures of the Church of the East, e.g., Babai the Great, etc." So I think he's interested in the where have we got to in terms of the translations and people applying critical apparatus to them.
Oh,
So,
Um,
say,
well, this is a question of what's available and what's been published and so on. Um, uh, there's a great deal of Severus of Antioch. In translation, he was condemned in the Chalcedonian tradition in 536, where he won over the patriarch of Constantinople on that occasion, Anthimus. But Justinian, and there's the politics in all this as well, which corrupt things. Severus of his publications are pretty well all published that survive, and they're mostly in Syriac translation, sometimes two translations, and the cathedral homilies, 125 of them, they were first translated probably short after his death in the mid-6th century. Then they were revised by Jacob of Edessa right at the end of his life, at the end of the 7th century. And it's that version that come down to us complete. The other version is only partial, unfortunately. And that earlier version actually has only partly been published. So there's work to do there. That needs to be done, certainly. Occasionally, new things turned up. In the Harvard collection of Syriac manuscripts, I came across quite an important letter, which is now published, to a certain Antiochus, who was a head of a monastery. It's to do with a heretical figure called Romanos, contemporary of Severus. Romanos seems to have had very curious exegetical ideas, but it's not a matter that survives. There are no followers of this Romanos today, totally different from the Greek poet Romanos, I should say. So there are a few things which still turn up. In the literature Church of the East, two very important things have happened last year, in fact. For a long time, Babai the Great's Christological works have been available in a Latin translation as well as the Syriac text, but today not so many people read Latin, so that's a barrier. There was a late chorepiscopos of the Church of the East, Michael Burney, who did a lot of translating of Syriac texts and good translations. He knew the texts well, knew the controversies well, and he translated Babai the Great's work on Christology, and that has now been published in a bilingual edition. So that's a great advance. And there's also, I gather, a Russian new edition, which is a critical edition as opposed to a reprint of the older edition. And one or two pages got of the most important manuscript got mixed up in the manuscript, and they need putting in the right place. If you know that, you can do that yourself, but it would be good to have a text where it's all correct. So that's one great new development, making these texts much more available to modern readers, because the Syriac is not easy to read. Perhaps the English is not easy because it's very complicated theology, Christology. The other good thing is that the Synodicon Orientale, as it's known, the collection of Eastern synods of the Church of the East, this was originally published with a French translation in 1902 by a great French scholar, and that's now been re-edited on the basis of an older manuscript, not very much difference in the actual text, but with an English translation, or rather a series of English translations, because it's a composite work. And this gives the collection of the synods of the Church of the East, beginning with the Synod of Seleucia Ctesiphon in 410, where Nicaea was accepted, and continuing up to the 8th century. a very important document because these synods um, very often include a creed of what the position of the church is at different periods. And one interesting thing that one notes from looking at this, the question of gnome doesn't turn up until the 7th century in these, as it were, official documents. So it turns up very late. So a lot is the sort of prehistory of how it developed, which we know very little about. And if you read the synods of the period well, post Ephesus, so we haven't got too many, but we have a number in the 6th century. There's one from the late 5th century. That's the only 5th century one besides 410. The language of the, as we're on what it says about Christology, would be acceptable to virtually everyone. So it's only when you get later on that you've got this as a fixture, or sometimes call it fossilization, or fixation of the terminology as a to canome. So the publication of this with an English translation is again a great assistance for people studying this, because I'm afraid not too many people read French either, probably more than Latin.
Yes.
So
Thank you. Yeah, no, look, the next question actually leads on from the last point that you've made. This is from Simon, who I believe is from the Church of the East himself. Dr. Brock, is there any credence to the position that the Church of the East was Nestorianized by Barsoma, and that the patriarchs prior, such as Mar Divisho and Mar Babawai, were Miaphysites? Or is this just polemical literature?
It's partly polemical literature, but there's, as often the case, behind the polemics, there's an element of truth. And that truth is the fact that in the Syrian Orthodox Church, you'll find that the Synod of 410 is one of the synods that has been traditionally accepted. And it's the text is transmitted. And in fact, and I've had to deal with this in a couple of papers on the Nicene Creed in the Syriac tradition. The text of the Syrian Orthodox transmission of the Creed in 410 is actually historically correct, or likely to be historically correct, whereas that in the Synodicon Orientale has actually been updated to what was the standard formulae in the 6th, 7th century in the Church of the East. This deals with the technical terms used to translate esarkothe and anthropise in the Greek. He was made incarnate and he became human. And in history of Syriac translation technique, it goes through a whole series of different ways of doing it. So you can plot these chronologically and you can come to interesting conclusions, such as the fact that the West Syriac, the Syrian Orthodox text of the Synod of the Seleucid Ctesiphon has the Nicene Creed in the original Syriac form and not an updated word. I should say that in modern usage, in the Creed, in both the Syrian Orthodox and the Church of the East tradition, they have the same wording for incarnation and became human, but it's, as it were, a middle position. They've got one of the technical terms, he was ethkasham, he was embodied instead of he was incarnate in flesh. But that's a technical point, which, but it's nice that both churches actually have the same wording and use the same technical terms. So it doesn't often happen like that, but it does this. So
Lovely. Well, Father James is asking a question. Thank you so much, Professor Brock, for a wonderful lecture. I do have a question. Since the Syrian Orthodox Church shares the same language and some of the same Holy Fathers, how is it that they would not have understood the teaching simply by sympathizing with the Syriac language? The East Syriac liturgy, notably the anaphora of Adian Mari, speaks for itself. The incarnation as God having put on the body, which indicates the union of divine and human nature from the moment of conception, not at a later stage. And another example is the inclination prayers give Mary the title, the Mother of God. Well, I never knew that. Your thoughts?
Yes. On the second point, uh, I wonder what is that a modern text? Because the text of Adan Mori has undergone, because it's controversial not having an institution narrative, and people have added institution narratives, different places at different times. And the phraseology used, especially in the manuscript edition, sometimes these manuscripts have gone through a Chaldean, as well, period, or where they would have altered Christotokos to Theotokos, and then sometimes that by chance turns up still today in usage in the Church of the East. And so one would need to look at the manuscript edition and the basis of the printed editions to discover what the real case is there. And I've gone and forgotten what the first part of the question was. I'm sorry.
Well, Father James has clarified. He's speaking about the edition by Brian Spinks in the 1980s, he thinks. He's not sure about the date.
Oh yes, yes. Well, that's a very good critical edition. I mean, it's actually just of the anaphora part. It's not of the rest of the thing. Um, I'm a bit surprised that it is there, but I'll look when I get have a chance. That's interesting. Um,
Lovely.
yes, the first point. Could you repeat the first point?
Yeah, so it was about the Syrian Orthodox Church sharing the same language and some of the holy
Oh, yes.
fathers. And
Yes,
would that have prevented the kinds of misunderstandings that happened with other churches?
to some extent, certainly, but not to the whole extent. Partly because of the ambiguity of certain terms. And for example, in the term nature, kiana, kiono, for the Church of the East, the sense is very close to ousia, being, essence. For the Oriental Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, it's much closer to hypostasis. So that is a basic, as well, difference of understanding, an important technical term. And of course, with knoma too, for the Syrian Orthodox, knoma in Christology always means hypostasis, whereas it doesn't in the Church of the East. So you can have the same term, same language, but still there's confusion. And one can confuse these things in English too. So it's not a question of all speaking English by going to solve things.
I think that's a very good analogy, actually, yes. The next question comes from Vasily. So I'm very glad that he's with us today. That means we have all the families of Orthodox
Oh,
Christianity.
good. Wonderful.
He's our token Chalcedonian here. He asks, Dear Sebastian, thank you for this illuminating presentation. I would like your opinion on your last point in the phrase two natures and their economy, in the sense of two natures and their natural or essential attributes or expressions, which I find as a fair, correct, and representative understanding of the Church of the East. Can one also read will and energies in place of attributes or expressions?
you can't replace it by wills because the Church of the East has always said there's one divine human will in the incarnate Christ. So that of course goes against Chalcedon, or not so much Chalcedon, against the 7th century developments of the Chalcedonian tradition. Well, energy, the trouble with energy, as with will, it has taken on its own life in the Chalcedonian tradition. The 7th century Chalcedonian controversies weren't influential in either the Oriental Orthodox or the Church of the East. They went their own way, and although sometimes said that the monothelite position was due to influence of the Oriental Orthodox one will, I'm not sure that that is really the case. It might have been. It's very difficult to say, but I would prefer not to, as it were, substitute those two terms, which well, definitely not will, because that would be misleading and against the position of the Church of the East. So it depends how you understand energia, activity. That might be a possibility, but I think introducing a technical term from a different tradition would not be helpful, personally. But thank you for bringing up that.
Great, thank you. So another question from Father James. I don't know if this is a bit of a conspiracy theory here. It's often said that Nestorius spent his final years exiled in Upper Egypt under the discipline of Shenuti of Atrib. Is this accurate? Does the Church of the East have any further information or sources about Nestorius's exile and his fate?
What we know about it comes from a work called the Book of Heraclides, which is under his name, but it was written in exile in Upper Egypt. Indeed, that's correct. But the activity of St. Shenouda, that I've not heard before. I think that must be an accretion to the tradition. And I'm sure there's nothing in the Book of Heraclides, which I have read. I think I would have remembered. My memory is not all that good, but I think I'd have remembered because Shenuti is such a well-known name to me.
Yes, and he had a reputation for being very strict, so I wonder if it
Oh,
wasn't.
yes, he sank an island. The landlord.
Wishful thinking from those who didn't like Nestorius.
Yes.
And what a great question to bring our time together to an end. We'll make this the last one. From Irene, a question about time. Professor Brock, thank you for a really interesting talk about things that are well beyond my understanding. There was one statement you made with regards to sacred time being sacred because of its content rather than its temporal characteristic. I wonder if the issue with language around division or distinction is more an issue of our limited understanding, of trying to understand things in terms of temporality rather than content.
I think there's a lot in what you say. I'm not sure how much the concept of sacred time helps in understanding the problems of the Christological controversies. It would, to a certain extent, because one speaking of things which, apart from Christ's incarnate life, are out of time and so belong to the sacred sphere. So you've got the coming together of the two, but to the as it were, the sacred effect of what's happening in Christ's incarnate time belongs to sacred time. And so runs together what happens at the conception with what happens at the ascension. So beginning and end. It's rather like protology and eschatology. They're not the same, but eschatology is, as it were, one stage further. And the same happens at the conception. It's the beginning of the process. At the ascension, it's the end of the effect of the incarnation. So, in that respect, it's important to keep these things in mind. And especially important, remember that one's dealing with mysteries which really can't be explained in a logical say. That is definitely the case. What is sacred is above logic.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you, everyone who came, and thanks for the excellent questions. A lot to think about there. Thank you very much, Sebastian, for giving us your time so generously and for sharing with us your prodigious experience. It's been really interesting. I've learned a couple of new things tonight that I didn't know about the Church of the East. So I hope it's been really useful for everyone who came. So yes, thank you, everyone. Our next Aletheia meeting is going to be not online; it will be in person at Saint Damiana Church in Sydney, and it's going to be Father Paul Fanous, who'll be addressing the question of whether God is different in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Are we dealing with two different gods? How do we make sense?
Very important. Yes.
So Father Paul, of course, lectures in Old Testament at St. Cyril's, and we'll be looking
Yes.
forward to
So
that.
good person to have.
Now we're going to, unfortunately, not be able to transcend time. We have to bring this time to a close. So lots of thank yous in the chat. Sebastian, thank you so much. It really is so much appreciated.
Well, thank you for listening. Complicated subjects. Hope I haven't confused everyone.
It has been a clarifying experience and a wonderful blessing. So thank you so much.
Well, not at all. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Have a lovely day or evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to do some shopping for our cat.
Oh, lucky cat.
Most important person in the house has run out of food.
Oh dear.
Good.
Thank you
Well,
all.
thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.